Your lecturer is Dr. Dalton Kehoe. Dr. Kehoe is Senior Scholar of Communications at York University and Senior Partner of Heart of the Matter Consulting, a firm dedicated to enhancing organizational communication. The author of Communication in Everyday Life, Professor Kehoe was recognized as one of the top 30 professors in Ontario by TVO, the province's public educational network.
Hello, I'm Professor Dalton Kehoe, Senior Scholar of Communications in the Department of Communication Studies at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. My fields of interest are interpersonal and organizational communication. And over the next 24 lectures, I will introduce you to the power and the very interesting complexity of face-to-face communication. I hope my presentations will illuminate the way our social experience, growing up learning to speak, and the development and operations of our mind interact to permit us to do the one thing we need to do without thinking about it very much: talk. It seems almost magical that we can accomplish so much in our daily lives about a skill that we take so for granted. I hope in these lectures to take talk out of the realm of the taken for granted and the automatic, and make us all aware of what gets in our way of being effective communicators, and show that getting better at the skill of talk is challenging, not impossible. To do this, we will focus not only on how we perform the magic act of speaking and getting others to understand us, but also, and perhaps more importantly, we'll deal with those situations where the magic doesn't seem to work, where we can't find the words, or worse, we say the wrong thing and we don't get what we want. Our talk fails us and communication breaks down. These situations can challenge us emotionally in the moment, and in the longer run, they can undermine our sense of competence and effectiveness as people. However, in this course, they will also provide insights into how talk actually works. Throughout the course, we will show when these situations are likely to occur and unfold, and offer you tools you can use to talk through them and come out feeling more competent and effective. Now, everyone knows how to talk. We talk endlessly, and in general, it works. We just start to talk, and we unthinkingly predict that the other person will get what we mean and what we want. So we speak and gesture, generally the way everybody else does, and the others respond in ways that we expect. Everything works. And when it does, we've been effective from our point of view. Now, we're going to use this word effective a lot, so let's be clear about what effectiveness actually means. It means three things. First, we got what we wanted. A moment of positive emotional connection, or some kind of tangible result because we made a deal or we made an exchange. Now, if you think about that for a moment, the or both is the ideal that we seek as human beings. Remember that time you actually had a special occasion? You took the whole family to a fancy restaurant, a beautiful place, wonderful food, but the waitstaff ignored you. And what do you remember when you leave the restaurant? Not the place, not the food, but how badly you were treated. Even when we're making exchanges and creating tangible results, we also prefer to make a positive emotional connection with other people. Now, the second element in our definition of effectiveness is that we've been understood from our point of view. The other has communicated that to us. And the third element is that the other seems fine with the exchange. There are no indications of uncertainty, frustration, fear, or anger on their part. In fact, if asked, they would say they got what they wanted to. Now, if this were it, if our daily lives were no more than a string of simple, how you doing? Great, that'll be $1.10, thanks, exchanges, then there would be little point in looking more deeply into the process of face-to-face talk. But that's not all that happens in our everyday exchanges, and sometimes, instead of feeling like we got what we expected, our interaction leaves us confused, unclear, upset, wanting. then suddenly our talk, which seems so effortless, now becomes complicated and difficult. What we don't realize is that we can ignore all the potentials for error and misunderstanding in everyday talk because our lives are so well structured, and the social situations we find ourselves in are so deeply regular and patterned. In fact, if we actually thought about the complexity of life in detail, every time we tried to talk, I think we all become mute. To experience this, you just have to put yourself in a situation where you don't share the deeply learned patterns of talk and interaction that everybody else in the room does. It happened to me a couple of years ago. First time I visited my wife's father's family in southern Italy. She's perfectly fluent in both languages, but I couldn't speak any Italian. I couldn't keep up with the flow. I was essentially mute for 2 days, can you imagine? I thought my head would explode, and I particularly thought it would explode when the senior aunt turns to the senior uncle at the opening part of the conversation and says, in Italian, my wife translates, "It must be terrible not to speak the language," right in front of me. So now I'm the disabled person for the rest of the conversation, and everybody just rolls on without me. And by the way, things have actually gotten better in the past year. This time we went back, people noticed that I could keep up with the flow, I could actually add a few words here and there. They were all very impressed. The important thing is we don't actually notice all of the background structuring in our lives that support us and make our talk so easily understood until it's not there. When it's gone, you miss it. Now let's take a quick peek at what lies behind all this deep learning and structure. Consider we have a picture, an image of a particular reality in our minds that we want to communicate. Say a stranger stops you and asks for directions. Now, to respond, we have to quickly pull together a collection of verbal symbols, words, whose single clear meaning will describe our image. Now, this ignores the fact that words have multiple arbitrary and fluid meanings, but more of that in Lecture 3. And then we have to assemble them into a recognizably ordered, non-graphical message to communicate this graphical image. We then utter the sound elements representing these verbal symbols in a way that we assume the other will recognize. But along with these utterances, we also transmit a set of nonverbal gestures. Now, some are intentional. You can use your hands to say how far, how high, how wide. But most of them are automatic, unintentional facial movements, tonal qualities of our voice. We don't have any control over these things. And all of this information flies through the air in a situation or a context where we assume there are no distracting interferences from external sources. We send them to the ears and eyes of another person in our certain belief that they will physically hear and see everything we said and stay mentally focused, pay attention, to what we said throughout the entire message. And then they'll decode or translate our non-graphical message correctly. That is, they'll pick our meanings, not theirs, from the archive of meanings they have accumulated based on their experience, not ours, while avoiding misinterpreting any number of our words because of the unintended and unconscious nonverbals that happen to be displayed at the same time as we spoke them. And then translate this message into the same picture in their minds without any distracting internal thoughts, feelings, or beliefs of their own. All this just to get our message, and then show us that they did. What are the chances here? Well, not great, actually. Surely you've been on the receiving end of directions from someone who knows how to get there and assumes you understand everything they're saying the way they meant it. Now, when we do this kind of thing, we pretend not to notice that the first time the other doesn't seem to get it. So we automatically repeat ourselves in the, again, absolute certainty that more words will simply do the trick. In fact, our simplistic view of face-to-face talk is so disconnected from the underlying realities of communication as the experts see it. They can actually make little jokes about this process, a little humor to get us to see things as they really are. Among my favorite so-called communication laws, written by Professor Osmo A. Wio, described on the web by a reviewer as a famous Finnish researcher, professor of communication. I went to his wiki page, and it turns out there seems to be a number of academic publications and practical experiences as a politician and broadcaster listed there. But more interestingly, he put together a set of 7 of what his reviewer calls humorously realistic laws of communication to make us smile a little bit and demonstrate just how fragile the whole process is. I want you to think of these as Murphy's laws of talk. He has 7. I'm just going to quote 3. My first one is the general one, covers every situation. Communication usually fails, except by accident. Now remember what I just said about all the instant choices each person has to make during a simple exchange. You can see how that would actually happen. Here's my favorite one for politicians and public communicators, which he obviously was. If a message can be interpreted in several ways, it'll be interpreted in a manner that maximizes the damage. Whoa, everybody knows that one. In fact, in a recent political race, I noticed one office holder discovering on TV that simply struggling to find any words to say at all and then not being able to say them on camera is just about as damaging as saying something that everybody can take the other way. It just makes you look incompetent. Now, here's one of my favorite for couples, and it'll be the last one we'll talk here. And I think you'll get this one. There's always someone who knows better than you what you meant by your message. Could that be the person sitting beside you right now? Now, this works for teachers, too. I've done lots of workshops over the years. Communication skills for leaders, interpersonal communication skills, group communication skills. And inevitably, someone at some point will say, I get it. I got your idea. And they'll let you know by their nonverbals. Sometimes they say it out loud. And then after the class is over, they run about the room telling everybody about my great idea. The only trouble is when I hear it back, it's usually not my idea at all. It's just their idea. They just think it's mine. For instance, when I'm teaching that managerial leaders need to set a clear direction for their employees, I overhear my new disciple at coffee, that is, telling someone that he agrees with me because unless you order people around to do things, they won't respect you as a boss. That is not what I said. In fact, that is as far away from my notion as managerial leadership as possible, but it worked for him. So I often have to spend time in the rest of the seminar firmly but gently undoing this understanding. However, I'm not quite as pessimistic about the process as Professor Wheel is. But I do get his intention. I think I do. After all, Law 1 says communication usually fails. Life and talk are immensely more complicated than we understand. But the apparent simplicity of talk is a kind of necessary working illusion that I argue we all have to share. I mean, among other things, having this kind of illusion about the simplicity of talk saves our sanity. It gets us to start talking. It gets things going. And it keeps us going as an apparently competent set of speakers. The downside, however, is that this illusion of simple talk doesn't set us up to learn much new about how we talk. Every time we say the right words at the right time and the other person responds in a predictable way, it sets us up not to prepare ourselves for more complicated and difficult situations. Difficult situations that emerge when talk doesn't happen predictably or produces unexpected results. Now, what are these moments? How about when you're resisting others' attempts to take something you don't want to give? When you're trying to get a beloved or a family member to see something important to you from your perspective, and they don't seem to understand or care? How about trying to get one of your children to pay attention and do what you want, and they resist you? How about when you're trying to keep your cool when others are angry, critical, frightened, distracted, or worse than that, they're demanding and demeaning in the way they talk to you? Now, there are many more of these situations. However, they all involve the same 3 elements, what I call the 3 Ds. They involve differences. That is, when others display differences in behavior, opinions, and values that seem beyond our immediate understanding, and which suddenly emerge in conversations when we thought we were talking to people just like us. Then there, of course, are obvious disagreements. This is when we are faced with outright, expected disagreement because differences have hardened into positions about how to think about something or what to do, and we can't seem to talk our way around their positions and reach a proper agreement on the situation. And disorder. When other people say things that just seem out of place, inappropriate, plain crazy. These situations, they all come through our lives and undermine our sense of the ease and simplicity of talk. Why? They arouse the negative emotions attached to unpredictability, surprise, threat, fear. We actually hate that. We yearn for good information about each other and the situation we happen to be in all the time. Let's define good here for a moment. Information that is relevant. When people say things to us, it sort of follows from what we've said to them. Truthful. We get the impression they're actually saying what's in their mind at the moment. So we're seeing their version of the world in real terms. And finally, clear. They speak to us in a way that we can understand. So when we talk, we actually make automatic predictions about others. And we don't want to work too hard at it. When it comes to everyday talk, we're energy misers, so we need this good information so we don't have to work. And when we do have to make conscious choices, we need good information to feel normal or effective in the moment when we have to choose. Now, it works the same way when we're on the receiving end of communication. We don't want to be taken by surprise or feel coerced or manipulated into a decision. Now, where are we going to go with this lecture and the next lectures around these issues? In this lecture, we're going to look more at our taken-for-granted model of everyday talk, which is focused on the exchange of words. And hopefully by the end, you'll begin to feel that maybe simple is not always better when it comes to dealing with or understanding talk. In the remaining lectures in the first half of the course, we're going to take a deeper look at the interpersonal, the things that happen between us, and the intrapersonal, processes that happen in our minds, the forces that make face-to-face talk really work. And in that process, we're going to see where things might go off the rails. I'm not going to throw you off the cliff like Professor Weo's smart alecky laws. As I said earlier, I want to help you anticipate potential pitfalls. Because in this second half of the course, we're going to give you tools to deal effectively with the inevitable complexity around some of the difficult and often very important moments, the ones we referred to earlier, that happen in our interpersonal communication. Now, interpersonal communication is simple, right? Didn't I say earlier we just start talking? That's what we do. Why do we share a model of talk that is so simple, just based on the exchange of words? Well, it's part of our cultural learning. It's part of a deep cultural and philosophical tradition in Western society. The right words spoken at the right time, in the right way, for the right audience, will change them in predictable ways. Now, this approach to influence and persuasion was formalized and published by Aristotle around the 4th century BC. It's called the rhetoric. Talk here is about getting other people to change, about influence and persuasion. And it's a kind of game, the presenter's verbal skills against the resistance of the audience to having their ideas changed in the first place. The other thing about it, as a kind of cultural model, is it looks like lots of other games we actually play. And of course, this reinforces our views of talk as a kind of game. For instance, take the model of tennis. Words are the ball, properly hit over the net. They compel the other to respond in a predictable way. We tell the other something, and they reply. Communication is about using words as actions, something to create predictable outcomes. Now, this word-centered model shows when we ask people to think of themselves as communicators, too. In a national survey called How Americans Communicate by the National Communication Association, they found that in general, 62% of Americans felt they were very comfortable communicators. In fact, in personal relationships with significant others, 87% rated themselves as very comfortable. Now, let's talk about comfort and effectiveness. When people said they were very comfortable communicating with people, the survey makes clear that they meant they could talk with relative ease. However, when they thought of themselves as effective things get different. Things go out differently. Compared to the 62% who were very comfortable, only 42% said they were actually very effective when communicating. Turns out this difference holds up no matter who people say they're comfortable in speaking with. Lovers, strangers, doesn't matter. In other words, we feel good saying what we say. From our point of view, we've used the right words, we've said them in the right way, we're not nervous, we're not distracted. But the effectiveness thing keeps coming up because we're not sure our message is getting across. Workplace communications follows the general pattern of relationship communication. 69% of the people who work in the survey are very comfortable communicating with their coworkers, although fewer, 57%, feel they're very comfortable communicating with their bosses. But as in other relationships, when people are talking about effectiveness, they feel they're less effective than comfortable when they're communicating at work as well. Now, people really do understand the problems that underlie ineffective communication from the point of view of personal relationships, because we ask them, would you choose the most frequent causes of marriage breakup from a long list? And among those they listed as very frequent causes, only 2 really stood out. A majority, 53% of the people in the survey, said a lack of effective communication between partners is the most frequent cause. Fewer than 3 in 10, 29%, said money was the next most frequent cause. All the other causes were ranked first by fewer than 1 out of 10 people. Now, what our sense of selves as very comfortable talkers doesn't do is give us much insight into the reasons for our feelings of ineffectiveness from time to time. Our focus on communication as the comfortable delivery of words implies that when others don't get our message, the problem lies with them, not us. After all, they're not getting our message, not us. We whacked the ball over the net. We get it. That's why we said it. Their return is their problem, not ours. So let me pose you a question. If you're in a conversation and you've told somebody something as clearly as you can once, and they don't get it, you're likely to tell them again. So you do it again, slowly, maybe a little more intensely this time, a little more loudly, and they still don't get it. What's the first reaction that pops into your mind? Not the first thing you say out loud, just your first sort of emotion thought. Isn't it likely, what's wrong with them? Yeah, they just didn't get it. What we don't get is the reason for the problem. It's what organizational communication theorist Chris Argyris calls a self-sealing belief. You don't have to learn anything about yourself or your communication anytime there's a problem, because we automatically can go into denial about any responsibility for it. It's like my favorite witness to a crime. It's a cartoon of a woman who was actually sitting on her couch, quite a nice-looking apartment, policeman standing in front of her. He's obviously asked her to describe the crime, and this is what she says. He misspoke, I misheard, and shots rang out. Amazing. Word-centered communication and denial of responsibility, all in one 8-word sentence. And don't you just love the passive tense at the end? And shots just somehow rang out. It's their fault, not ours. This is more than a choice to be arrogant in the moment. Neuroscientists think our brains seem to be hardwired to reinforce our I am a very comfortable communicator, you're a dunce model of explaining communication problems. It just seems to be a natural response. In her funny and very informative book, A Mind of Its Own, neuropsychologist Cordelia Fine reviews the experimental literature to conclude that whenever challenged, our brain embellishes, enhances, and aggrandizes us. Now, with her tongue thoroughly in her writing cheek, she reviews survey data that says that when asked, we will modestly and reluctantly confess that we are more honest, better motivated employees, or better drivers than the average person. In fact, the study about self-perception of better driving even includes a sample of people in emergency rooms shortly after they'd been extricated from their wrecked cars. We just never consider ourselves in the bottom half of any dimension of general behavior. Social psychologists call this the self-serving bias. More poetically, she calls it our vain brain. It excuses our faults and failures. It sets us up on a pedestal above all others. It keeps us blind to our own inadequacies. And when things go well, we take full credit. And when things don't, we blame the circumstances. Now, if we don't get something we want, we do a reversal of this. We just tend to devalue it in our perceptions. It isn't worth our effort. Now, the vain brain allows us to gain and keep the illusion of control in life. An experiment where lab volunteers are asked to try to get a light to come on by pressing a button. They're told that the button might control the light. In fact, it actually goes on and off at random. Doesn't matter. If the light comes on while they're pressing, they think they did it. And the more often it happens to come on in the experiment, the more they're convinced they actually controlled it. Now, this illusion can include any of our beliefs. Fine talks about her struggle with her husband, about how to get their second child back to sleep. She walks into the nursery and finds him pacing with the child over his right shoulder to get her to go to sleep. She goes, no, that's not the way you do it. I love when psychologists talk at real people about their own lives. No, you have to sit down in the chair over here in the corner. You have to put her on your left shoulder. You have to gently rock her this way or she won't go to sleep. How does her husband respond? That's why it takes you so long to get her to sleep. That's not what you do. You put her over the other shoulder, you walk back and forth. Oh, and by the way, would you pull that blind down to about 2 inches off the sill? Because that makes a real difference to whether she's going to go to sleep quickly. Can you imagine the madness here? However, she argues that this kind of positive self-centeredness, I guess is a pleasant way of putting it, is essential to our perseverance in what turns out to be a very complex and unpredictable world. The vain brain also reinforces our cultural model of what to do when our talk is challenged, particularly when we're faced with those disagreements we talked about earlier. We've learned that you have to debate. Talk is a contest. It's a game on steroids. And the assumption that lies behind this mode of talk are outlined by Deb Flick in her book, From Debate to Dialogue. We start by assuming there's a right answer, and we have it. And if we don't have it now, we'll find it by proving the other side wrong. By listening only to find flaws in their arguments, and then build counter-arguments. By defending our assumptions as if they were objective facts or truths. Critiquing their position, and finally seeking a conclusion that justifies our position. After all, we know we're right on this, whatever it is. We are way better than average. Discovering truth through contest actually may work in formal debates where participants are compelled by the rules to present coherent arguments and supporting data. It doesn't work so well for everyday disagreements. So let me summarize all this. Our cultural learning tells us that talk is about words and about influencing people. It's influential. Getting what we want, saying the right words in the right way, influencing people. We often think of conversation as a result as a kind of game, batting the words back and forth, or as a kind of contest if someone disagrees with us. Our minds are wired to think of ourselves as better than average in everyday situations, and when our thoughts are somehow challenged, we naturally think of ourselves as right. Now, all of this compels in us a view that talk is fundamentally simple. If they don't get it, it's their fault, a kind of approach to interpersonal communication. I hope by now you're beginning to see, at least that I think there might be a great deal more to our talk than our surface assumptions actually suggest. In fact, to become better at talk, we need to know more and blame far less when we're dealing with difficult situations. So in Lecture 2, we're going to offer you a model of talk that is more useful in explaining how the process works. And in Lectures 3 and 4, we'll analyze the forces that drive this automatic or natural talk, the deep cultural templates for talk we've been referring to here, and the deep cultural templates for action which shape everything we do or say, but we can no longer remember learning. This will come out in Lecture 3. In Lecture 4, we'll review the operations of the cognitive unconscious part of the mind that stores all this early learning and energizes every choice that our conscious mind makes. And finally, throughout the rest of the course, I hope you'll learn to recognize these forces at work in difficult situations. Learn to speak more consciously in ways that prevent our hardwired overconfidence and natural responses from taking over to make things worse, or at least not make things any better. I hope that you'll learn to speak so that people will listen to you more openly, and listen so that people will speak to you more openly. So you can get the good information that you need to make better choices when facing life's disagreements, differences, and disorder. Now, before I conclude, I want you to run a couple of thought experiments before you watch the next lecture. I want you to think of a situation where you talk directly with another about something you wanted, something you needed, but you didn't get it. As you recall the scene, notice your first emotional reaction to the person you're recalling. Is it positive? Negative? Did you call up a label for them, or some label describing the way they talk to you? And what was it? Positive or negative? We will look at these natural reactions as we move through the first section of the course. Also, I want you to think about, is there a situation in the recent past where, looking back, you feel the other person didn't really listen to you and what you had to say? And had they listened to you, the outcome would have been better for you and for them. How do you feel about this situation now when you recall it? Remember this feeling. We'll get back to it, and we'll get back to the importance of listening later in the course. Thanks very much.